Hey everyone! For a while now, people have been suggesting that I upgrade the Potato Masher's CPU from an i5-750 to a Xeon x3440. I haven't paid this that much mind because my intention has always been to see how one set of hardware competes against the PS4 for the rest of its life cycle. So other than changing the RAM after the first year and a free upgrade to Windows 10, I haven't done much else to the computer itself. But rising CPU requirements in games over the past year or two are making me wonder how cost-effective of a CPU upgrade an x3440 is for somebody in my position or somebody doing their own build. So I went on eBay, and after scooping my jaw off the floor, I bought one for a buy-it-now price of $16 shipped. It turns out x3440s have depreciated to almost the exact same average sale price as an i5-750, within $1 or $2. That means if I was to change processors, other than my time, this is a no-cost upgrade. If you already know where this is going, there's a poll in the video description. Get in there and let me know what you think. Now, in case you're wondering why a Xeon processor would be an upgrade for an i5-750, here's a quick overview of the similarities and differences between the two. The i5-750 is a 4-core, 4-thread Nehalem processor with a stock speed of 2.66 GHz, and I've overclocked mine to 3.7 GHz. The x3440 is from a short period of time where Xeon workstation processors were overclockable using the same front-side bus method as the consumer chips before Intel switched to mostly multiplier overclocking and locking down certain chips to stock speeds. The x3440 is a quad-core, 8-thread, hyper-threaded CPU that has a stock speed of 2.53 GHz. It's on the Linfield platform, but it works in the same socket as the i5-750. The x3440 has a few differences in PCI lanes, and it supports up to 32 GB of RAM compared to 16 GB on the 750. Both are 45 nanometer, both use about the same amount of power, both have the same cache. So the main differences are a slight clock speed advantage for the i5 and a multi-thread advantage for the Xeon. In case you're wondering why the Xeon is so cheap, these were popular processors for workstations, servers, rendering rigs, and other non-gaming applications. The aftermarket for these processors isn't as popular as it is for most consumer chips, so the supply is more than the demand. This is great for budget gamers, providing you get a good deal on a compatible motherboard and RAM since both are starting to get a bit older. I wasn't able to overclock the Xeon quite as far as the i5-750. It is stable at 3.4 GHz, so 300 MHz slower than the i5. That's still a respectable overclock over stock speeds, and if someone was doing a build with a better cooler than the extremely budget cooler the Masher uses, they could probably bump the voltage and end up closer to 4 GHz. I've tested 7 games at 1080p and 4K resolutions, always at medium settings. I chose medium because that will take some of the load off the GPU, while still being realistic to what gamers might actually set the game at. The best way to see a difference in two CPUs is to game at low resolutions with low settings to put as much strain on the CPU as possible. But I'm more interested in real-world performance differences, which is why I'm doing it this way. If you're not familiar with the Potato Masher Pro, here are its normal specs, with the only difference today being the Xeon processor. So a GTX 1060, 8 GB of RAM, and 7 games that all put a serious load on a budget processor. Let's see how they do. Up first is Dishonored 2. You'll notice that I'm measuring average, 1% low, and 0.1% low frame rates. Now, with no VSync or any other frame rate limiting or smoothing at work, you'd expect to see some wild jumps in frame rate from time to time, so I don't put that much stock in the 0.1% lows since they'll always look much worse than how a game feels when you're playing it normally. But the 1% lows and the average frame rates do give you a good idea of how the game will feel when you actually play it. At 1080p, the i5 has an average frame rate of 83 with a 1% low of 58, while the Xeon has an average of 77 with a 1% low of 59, so actually a little bit slower at 1080p. At 4K, they are essentially identical, both having averages of 29 FPS and a 1% low of 24 FPS, which is going to be a trend you're going to notice. At 4K, even with a big difference in processor, the GPU is still almost always the significant limiting factor. There's a big difference in Kingdom Come Deliverance. The i5 has an average of 57 frames per second with a 1% low of 27 and a 0.1% low of 16 FPS, which is pretty bad, and if you remember my video about Kingdom Come Deliverance, you'll remember that it does have some performance issues. The Xeon has an average of 73 FPS, a 1% low of 43, and a 0.1% low of 33, so even not putting a huge amount of stock in the 0.1% lows, that is a massive difference, and it's very obvious that it's going to be much better to play this game at 1080p on the Xeon. At 4K, again, not much of a difference. 1 frame per second slower for the Xeon for average frame rate, and the 1% lows are the same, and the 0.1% lows, it's also 1 frame per second slower, which is within the realm of statistical deviation, so I don't really put that much of a weight on a 1 frame per second difference. In Ghost Recon Wildlands, the i5 has an average frame rate of 63 with a 1% low of 44, and the Xeon has an average frame rate of 71 with a 1% low of 57. So that is a pretty good upgrade. And at 4K, it's once again ever so slightly slower with an average of 33 and a 1% low of 28. Still within the realm of statistical deviation, but it is likely that it is slightly worse because Wildlands does like a higher clock speed on these older processors. The Witcher 3 is a game with another massive difference, and this is riding through the streets of Novigrad for anyone who's curious, but the i5 has an average of 55 FPS and a 1% low of 26, while the Xeon has an average of 72 and a 1% low of 56. So its 1% low is better than the average for the regular i5, and then the Xeon has a 0.1% low of 48 FPS, which is over 2 times better than the 0.1% low for the i5. And then at 4K, 32 versus 33 FPS for the average, not much difference, and then the 0.1% and the 1% lows are essentially the same. In Divinity Original Sin 2, the Xeon is 4 FPS better average frame rate with a 66 versus a 62, and then once again the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows are significantly better, showing that while the average frame rate may not be a lot better, the frame rate is a lot more consistent with the Xeon processor. And then this is one of the rare games that actually sees a significant difference at 4K because the game is so CPU intensive in towns. The average frame rate is the same, but the Xeon's 1% low and 0.1% lows are 12 FPS and 8 FPS better respectively. So that's a pretty significant difference. Once again, average not much different, but that is putting even the 0.1% low above 30 FPS. Planet Coaster is an incredibly CPU intensive game, and I do plan on making a full review video of it, but I mean, it's just brutal on CPUs. So at 1080p, you'll see that the Xeon has a 2 FPS better average, and then the 1% and 0.1% are good enough that I think it's outside the realm of statistical deviation. I think it is a good noticeable difference in performance. And then at 4K, the Xeon is once again better across the board. You'll notice that 0.1% low of 8 FPS on the regular i5. This game runs really, really bad on old rigs. I'm not exactly sure why. I've run other games similar to it. I guess it just is that CPU intensive, or it has some optimization issues. And then finally, Final Fantasy 15, which was actually a bit of a surprise to me because in some preliminary testing I've done for a Potato Masher video, it is pretty CPU intensive, or at least it seems to be, but at 1080p, the average frame rates are almost the same, the 1% lows are almost the same, and you do see a pretty noticeable difference in the 0.1% lows. But again, that could be explained by just a momentary frame rate hitch. So, I mean, it's better, but it doesn't really play that much differently. And then at 4K, the Xeon is a little bit worse in the average and 1% lows. Still very playable, but a couple FPS worse, which shows that Final Fantasy might prioritize clock speed over extra threads, even though it seems to max all the threads out. So I think it's a pretty interesting result. So what does all this mean? Well, I think if you're doing a new build right now, or a new build with used parts, the x3440 is probably worth it over the i5-750, especially if you can get a better cooler and get a little more of an overclock on it. In my situation, I'm not exactly sure what I want to do. That's why I want you guys to go vote in the poll you see in the description. If this was like a $30 or $40 upgrade, of course, I would leave it alone and I would, keep the comparisons going as they are. But since this is a no-cost trade, it kind of makes sense to switch. I'm not sure I want to. I want to do whatever you guys think makes the most sense, but I think it's very interesting how you can get a hyper-threaded quad-core for under $20 shipped. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Now, of course, you've got to find a decent motherboard and you've got to find decent RAM, but I checked online. You can still get pretty respectable deals on those. I mean, it's going to put you at cheaper than any new budget processor, and it's still going to perform better than some of them. So I think it is still worth doing. It just depends on how much effort you want to put into it. But in my situation, I think the x3440 is a slam dunk, but I'm still willing to keep the i5-750 in the machine for the rest of its life cycle if that's what you guys prefer. I absolutely would not be switching off between the two of them for every video. That would be way too much work. and I'd have to get the overclock stable each time and everything else. So definitely not going to do that. I'm going to pick one and stick with it. But I'm curious to see what you guys think. So let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if were you surprised? Was it exactly what you thought it would be? And what do you think I should do going forward? Thanks for watching. Have a great day.